My dear friends, sometimes it just takes one moment, one single headline to illuminate everything. One outburst can reveal what years of careful presentation tried to keep hidden. For former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, serving here as governor of California, that pivotal moment arrived when the Department of Justice uttered those three simple yet powerful words: "We're monitoring California." Within hours, cameras captured a very public display of the governor's frustration, and by sunrise, a federal audit had achieved what his critics couldn't. It truly shook the image he had meticulously built. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Joel, politicians have tough days. They lose their temper. They say things they regret. And yes, that's absolutely true. But my friends, this wasn't just a bad day. This was the unraveling of a carefully constructed persona, a moment where reality caught up with the narrative, and it all happened in real time for the entire nation to witness. What we're about to explore together isn't just another political story. It's a profound case study in what happens when truth finally catches up with the story we're telling. We're going to unpack three crucial pillars here. First, the meltdown itself, the moment Governor Cuomo lost his composure over federal election monitors. Second, we'll look at the hidden power play behind Proposition 50, a ballot initiative he was betting his political future on. And third, we'll examine the shocking federal audit that exposed a system so deeply challenged, it very well may have brought an end to his career for good. Let's rewind, if you will, to where this domino effect truly began. It was a phone call that I'm sure former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo probably wishes was never recorded. Picture this. It's a typical weekday afternoon in Sacramento. The governor's office receives word that the U.S. Department of Justice is deploying federal election monitors to 5 California counties. Not a raid, not an investigation, just monitors. Observers, really, sent to ensure that an upcoming special election is conducted fairly. Now, for many of us, this is standard procedure. The DOJ has been doing this for decades, under both Republican and Democratic administrations. It's about as controversial as a health inspector visiting a restaurant. But for Governor Cuomo, it might as well have been a declaration of war. Within hours, he was standing in front of the cameras. And let me tell you, my friends, this was not the polished, rehearsed Governor Cuomo we usually see. This was something else entirely. His voice cracked. His hands gestured wildly. He called it voter intimidation. He insisted it was federal interference in a state election. He even invoked the very spirit of democracy itself, suggesting it was hanging in the balance. And then, this is the part that truly went viral. He declared that the Trump administration had no business, no jurisdiction to do this. Now, here's where it truly gets interesting, because legally, my friends, he was mistaken. The Voting Rights Act grants the DOJ explicit authority to monitor elections, especially in jurisdictions with a history of irregularities. And California, well, let's just say it hasn't always been a shining example of electoral transparency. In fact, just a few years back, over 1,000 non-citizens were accidentally registered to vote due to a Department of Motor Vehicles error. Accidents can happen, of course, but when you're leading a state with a population larger than Canada's, those accidents can start to look like systemic problems. So when the DOJ announced they'd be sending monitors to counties like Los Angeles, Orange, Riverside, Fresno, and Kern, it wasn't some sinister plot. It was actually quite routine, the kind of thing that usually doesn't even make the news. But Governor Cuomo's reaction? That made the news. You have to ask yourself, with an open heart and a seeking mind, why did he panic? Why the theatrics? After all, if your elections are clean, if everything is truly above board, then what's the problem with a few observers taking notes? It's like getting upset that someone's watching you take a test you've already studied for. Unless, of course, you didn't study, or unless the timing simply couldn't have been worse. Because here's what most people didn't realize at the time, and this is crucial. This announcement came just days before one of the most consequential special elections in California's recent history. An election that Governor Cuomo had personally championed. An election that, if successful, would hand him and his party unprecedented control over the state's political map for the next decade. That election was about Proposition 50. Now, if you've never heard of Prop 50, don't feel bad. It wasn't exactly front-page news outside of California, and even inside the state, it was marketed in the most mundane, bureaucratic language possible. Something about redistricting, reform, and updating the state constitution. You know, the kind of language that makes you want to yawn, right? But dig a little deeper and you realize what Prop 50 truly was, my friends. A power grab disguised as a procedural update. Here's a bit of background. Back in 2008, California voters passed Proposition 11, which took the power to draw congressional district lines away from politicians and gave it to an independent commission. The idea was simple, and truly it was a good one. Stop letting elected officials draw their own maps. Stop letting them gerrymander districts to guarantee safe seats for themselves and their party. Let a neutral body do it, based on population data, community interests, and fairness. It was one of those few good government reforms that actually worked. Both parties grumbled about it, but it made the process cleaner, more transparent, less cynical. And Governor Cuomo wanted to reverse it. Prop 50 would have amended the state constitution to allow partisan considerations back into the redistricting process. It was framed as giving communities a voice and responding to changing demographics. But make no mistake, this was about power, pure and simple. If it passed, the governor's allies would have the ability to redraw district lines in a way that could flip up to 5 congressional seats from Republican to Democrat. 5 seats in a House of Representatives where the majority was decided by a margin of fewer than 10. That's not just significant, it's seismic. It would effectively hand Democrats control of Congress, not through persuasion or winning over voters, but through cartography, by simply moving lines on a map. Now, I'm not here to tell you that's illegal. It's not. Gerrymandering, as much as we may dislike it, is technically legal in most places. But here's the thing, and this is where we need to pay attention. Californians had already voted against this. They had already said, no, we don't want politicians picking their voters. And here was Governor Cuomo asking them to change their minds because, well, it would really help his team. So you can begin to see why the DOJ's timing rattled him. He needed this election to go smoothly. He needed high turnout from his base and low scrutiny from the press. He needed people to vote yes on Prop 50 without asking too many questions. And then the federal government shows up with clipboards and badges saying, we're just here to watch. That's when the masks slip, my friends. Because when you've spent years selling yourself as the defender of democracy, the champion of voting rights, the person who stands up to authoritarianism, and then you panic over election monitors, people notice. They start to wonder. They start to connect the dots. Let me paint you a picture of what that meltdown looked like. Imagine you're watching the evening news. The anchor cuts to a live feed from Sacramento. There's Governor Cuomo standing at a podium looking more disheveled than usual. His tie is a little crooked. His hair, which is usually perfect, let's be honest, is slightly out of place. And his voice has this edge to it, this barely controlled fury. He starts talking about voter intimidation and suppression tactics. He says the Trump administration is trying to chill voter turnout by sending federal agents into minority communities. He invokes the Civil Rights era, the Voting Rights Act, the long history of struggle for equal access to the ballot. And all of this would be very stirring, very powerful, if it weren't completely backwards. Because here's the irony, and sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. The Voting Rights Act is exactly what authorizes the DOJ to send those monitors. The whole point of election monitoring is to protect voters, especially in places where there's been a history of suppression or irregularities. It's not a tool of oppression, it's a check against it. But Governor Cuomo was spinning it the opposite way. He was taking a civil rights protection and framing it as a civil rights violation. And a lot of people bought it, at least at first. Then someone did the math. A reporter, I won't name names, but bless them, dug into the history of DOJ election monitoring. Turns out, during the 2024 general election, the Biden administration's Justice Department sent monitors to over 80 jurisdictions across more than 25 states. That was the largest deployment in 2 decades. And you know how many Democratic governors complained? 0. How many called it voter intimidation? None. How many held press conferences calling it a bridge too far? Not one. So either election monitoring is a democratic safeguard that both parties support when they're in power, or it's a sinister plot that only becomes sinister when the other party does it. You cannot have it both ways. But Governor Cuomo tried. And that's when people started to him asking the uncomfortable question, the one that points to something deeper. What is he so afraid of? Now, I want to be fair here. Governor Cuomo is not naive. He's a savvy politician. He knows how to work a room, command a stage, deliver a soundbite. He didn't get to be governor of the largest state in the union by accident. So when someone like that loses their cool so publicly, so dramatically, it's worth paying attention to the context. And the context, as we've established, was Prop 50. But it was also something deeper, something that hadn't fully come to light yet, but was lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to explode. That something was a federal audit, an audit that had been quietly underway for months, an audit that was examining California's compliance with federal transportation and safety regulations, an audit that would soon reveal a staggering, almost unbelievable lapse in oversight. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's stay with the meltdown for a moment, because it's important to understand just how much this rattled his image. You see, former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo's brand, and I use that word deliberately, has always been about being the competent progressive, the one who gets things done, the adult in the room. He's California's answer to the chaos of national politics. Sleek, polished, media savvy. He's the governor who stood up to Trump on immigration, on climate, on various issues. He's the one who looked into the camera and said, "We're better than this." And a lot of people believed him, not just in California, but across the country. He was even floated as a potential presidential candidate. He did national interviews. He became the face of blue state America. But here's the thing about brands, my friends. They are fragile. They only work as long as people believe the story. And once that belief cracks, once people start to see the gap between the image and the reality, it's very hard to put it back together. The meltdown over the DOJ monitors was that crack, because suddenly people weren't seeing the calm, confident leader. They were seeing someone defensive, reactive, scared even. And fear, more than anything else, is what undermines authority. When a leader panics, it signals to everyone else that maybe things aren't as under control as they thought. And in Governor Cuomo's case, things definitely weren't under control, because while he was busy ranting about election monitors, the real story was just beginning to surface. A story about how, under his watch, California had issued tens of thousands of commercial driver's licenses to people who were in the country illegally. People who, in many cases, didn't speak English fluently. People who hadn't passed the same rigorous testing that legal residents and citizens have to pass. And some of those people were now driving 50,000-pound semi-trucks on California's highways. Now, before I go any further, let me be absolutely clear about something. I'm not here to demonize immigrants. People come to this country for all kinds of reasons, many of them desperate, many of them noble. They're looking for work, for safety, for a better life. I get that. We all get that. But there's a difference between compassion and negligence. And when you start handing out commercial driver's licenses to people who aren't legally authorized to be here, who haven't met the federal standards for operating heavy machinery on public roads, you're not being compassionate, you're being reckless. And the numbers, when they finally came out, were staggering. The federal audit found that California had issued somewhere between 60,000 and 65,000 CDLs to individuals who either entered the country illegally or didn't have permanent legal status. That's not a rounding error. That's not a clerical mistake. That's a policy choice, a deliberate decision to prioritize ideology over public safety. And it was all traceable back to California's sanctuary state laws. Here's how it worked. California law prohibits state agencies from asking about immigration status. That includes the Department of Motor Vehicles. So when someone applies for a driver's license, even a commercial one, the DMV can't ask if they're here legally. They can't check. They can't verify. In theory, this is supposed to make undocumented immigrants feel safer. The idea is that if people aren't afraid of being reported to federal authorities, they'll be more likely to get licenses, get insurance, and follow the rules of the road. And in some cases, maybe that works. But in practice, it created a massive loophole because a commercial driver's license isn't just a license to drive. It's a certification that you meet federal safety standards. It's a document that says this person has been trained and tested and is qualified to operate a vehicle that, if mishandled, can kill dozens of people in an instant. And California was handing those out without doing the necessary checks. Now, when this audit dropped, it didn't make headlines right away. These things rarely do. Federal audits can be quite mundane. They're full of jargon and bureaucratic language. They get published on government websites that nobody reads. But someone at the Department of Transportation read it, and someone at the Department of Justice read it, and they started asking questions, hard questions. Questions like, how did this happen? Who approved it? And what are we going to do about it? And that's when Governor Cuomo's very bad week turned into a very bad month. Because once the Trump administration got wind of the audit findings, they didn't just write a strongly worded letter and move on. They did what any administration focused on accountability would do. They hit California where it hurts, in the wallet. The Secretary of Transportation, a leader who had spent years in Congress and knew exactly how federal leverage works, announced that California would be losing about $40 million in federal highway funding immediately. Not next year, not pending review, but now. And that was just the first cut. He went on to explain that unless California came into compliance with federal CDL standards, which meant verifying immigration status and revoking licenses that had been improperly issued, another $160 million or so would follow. And if that didn't work, well, the federal government had one more card to play. They could revoke California's authority to issue commercial driver's licenses altogether. Think about what that means for a second, my friends. California, the fifth largest economy in the world, the state with more trucks on the road than most countries, would lose the ability to certify its own drivers. The backlog alone would paralyze the state's logistics industry. Ports, warehouses, distribution centers, all of it would grind to a halt. It was the nuclear option. And the fact that it was even on the table told you how serious Washington was. Now, if you're Governor Cuomo, you're looking at this and realizing that your political identity, your entire brand as the person who stands up to Trump, who protects immigrants, who defends California's autonomy, is suddenly colliding with the hard reality of federal law. And here's the thing about physics. When two objects collide, the smaller one usually loses. California is big, yes, but the federal government is bigger, and Governor Cuomo knew it. So he did what any politician in damage control mode does. He pivoted. He stopped talking about the DOJ monitors. He stopped ranting about voter intimidation. And he started talking about highway safety partnerships and working collaboratively with federal agencies. In other words, he blinked. But by then it was too late. The narrative had already shifted. People weren't talking about election monitors anymore. They were talking about the CDL scandal. They were asking how this could have happened. They were demanding to know why the governor's office hadn't caught this years ago. And more importantly, they were connecting it to a larger pattern. Because the CDL issue wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was part of a much broader confrontation between California's sanctuary state policies and federal immigration enforcement. And that confrontation was reaching a boiling point. Let me give you some context. Over the past few years, California had passed some of the most aggressive sanctuary laws in the country. These laws didn't just limit cooperation with federal immigration authorities, they actively penalized it. Local police chiefs could be fined or even face legal action if they shared information with IC. Sheriffs were prohibited from honoring federal detainer requests unless they came with a judicial warrant. And in some cities, officials were instructed to warn communities ahead of time if ICE was planning an operation. Now, you can have a reasonable debate about sanctuary policies. Some people think they make communities safer by encouraging immigrants to report crimes without fear of deportation. Other people think they undermine federal law and create zones where immigration enforcement is essentially impossible. Both sides have valid arguments. But here's where it gets complicated. When state officials start actively obstructing federal agents, well, not just refusing to help, but actually getting in the way, you're no longer talking about policy disagreements. You're talking about a constitutional crisis. And that's exactly what started happening. In Illinois, the governor issued a directive that local police should not only refuse to cooperate with IC, but should arrest federal agents if they attempted to conduct operations without going through state channels first. Let me say that again. Arrest federal agents for doing their jobs that are explicitly authorized by federal statute. California wasn't far behind. Officials in San Francisco and Los Angeles began publicly identifying ICE agents, posting their photos and names on social media, essentially doxing them. The stated reason was transparency. The actual effect was intimidation. Because when you make someone's identity public, when you paint a target on their back in a political climate this heated, you're not promoting accountability. You're endangering lives. And the federal government responded exactly the way you'd expect. The Deputy Attorney General sent letters to multiple state and local officials, including Governor Cuomo, warning them that obstructing federal officers is a federal crime, not a civil violation, not a policy dispute, but a crime punishable by fines and imprisonment. The letters were polite but unambiguous. Preserve your records, cease interference, and understand that continued obstruction will result in prosecution. The Attorney General went on national television and said it even more bluntly. She looked into the camera and said, "You cannot arrest federal agents for doing their jobs. And if you think you can, you haven't met me yet." It was the kind of line that gets clipped and shared a million times. And the message was clear. The days of symbolic resistance and political theater were over. This administration was playing for keeps. Now here's where this takes a turn that I don't think anyone fully anticipated, because up until this point, most of the pushback against California's sanctuary policies had come from conservatives, from red states, from people who were already skeptical of Governor Cuomo's approach. But once the CDL audit became public, once people started connecting the dots between sanctuary laws and public safety failures, the criticism started coming from inside California itself. Polls started shifting, not dramatically, but noticeably. Californians, even liberal ones, started saying things like, "I support helping immigrants, but I also want to know that the person driving the truck next to me on the freeway is qualified." Or, "I don't think federal agents should be harassed for enforcing the law." It was a subtle but significant change because California's political culture is built on a kind of progressive consensus. The assumption that if you're on the left, you support sanctuary policies, you oppose ICE, you resist Trump. But when your own safety or your family's safety gets thrown into the equation, ideology starts to give way to pragmatism. And that's when Proposition 50 started to collapse. Remember, Governor Cuomo needed this ballot measure to pass. He'd staked a lot of political capital on it. He'd framed it as a way to protect California's voice in Congress, to ensure fair representation, to push back against Republican gerrymandering in other states. And for a while, it looked like it might work. Early polling showed it narrowly ahead. But then the meltdown happened. Then the audit dropped. Then the federal crackdown began. And suddenly, voters weren't thinking about congressional districts. They were thinking about whether their governor could actually manage the state. Confidence, once lost, is very hard to rebuild. Here's an analogy, my friends. Imagine you're renovating your house and you hire a contractor who promises you the moon. Beautiful designs, top-notch materials, ahead of schedule. You believe him. You pay the deposit. Work begins. But then one day you come home and find that the plumbing doesn't work. The contractor says it's not his fault, it's the city's fault for changing the codes. Okay, fine. Then the electrical wiring fails inspection. Again, not his fault, it's the inspector's fault for being too strict. All right, maybe. But then you discover that he's been hiring unlicensed workers, that he's been cutting corners on materials, that half the crew doesn't speak English and can't read the building plans. At that point, it doesn't matter how good his sales pitch was. You've lost trust. And once that trust is gone, every new problem just confirms what you already suspect. This person is in over their head. That's what happened to Governor Cuomo. The Prop 50 election happened on a Tuesday in early November, just over a week after the DOJ monitor controversy, and 2 days after the CDL audit made national news. Turnout was lower than expected, always a bad sign for ballot measures. And when the results came in, it wasn't even close. Proposition 50 failed, not by a slim margin, but decisively. Almost 60% of voters said no. Even in deep blue counties, even in places where Governor Cuomo had won by huge margins in his own elections, voters rejected. But political analysts scrambled to explain what had happened. Some blamed the messaging, some blamed the timing, some blamed Trump or federal overreach or voter confusion. But the simplest explanation, my friends, was the most accurate. People didn't trust Andrew Cuomo anymore. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. Joel, isn't this just politics? Don't politicians fail all the time? And yes, of course they do. But this was different because Andrew Cuomo wasn't just a governor trying to pass a policy. He was a national figure, a potential presidential candidate, someone who'd been anointed as the future of the Democratic Party. And in the span of 2 weeks, that image shattered. The national media, which had been largely friendly to him, started asking harder questions. Cable news panels that used to feature him as the voice of reason now dissected his mistakes. Late-night comedians who had mostly left him alone started making jokes. Not mean-spirited ones necessarily, but the kind of jokes that signal a shift in perception. Once you become a punchline, it's very hard to become a statesman again. Behind the scenes, Democratic Party insiders started distancing themselves. Donors who'd written big checks to Governor Cuomo-aligned PACs started hedging their bets. Endorsements for his potential presidential run Endorsements that had been lined up months in advance quietly evaporated. And other ambitious Democrats, governors, and senators who'd been waiting their turn started making moves. Because here's how politics works, my friends. The moment people sense weakness, they circle. Not out of cruelty necessarily, but out of opportunity. If Andrew Cuomo is not the future, then someone else is. And everyone wants to be that someone else. Meanwhile, the federal government kept turning the screws. The Department of Justice opened formal investigations into obstruction of federal agents in multiple California jurisdictions. The Department of Homeland Security announced a task force specifically aimed at dismantling sanctuary policies that violated federal law. And IC, which had been operating somewhat cautiously in California, started conducting high-profile raids in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Diego. Each raid was carefully choreographed for maximum visibility. Cameras, press releases, statements from local ICE directors, thanking the Trump administration for finally letting them do their jobs. It was political theater, sure, but it was effective political theater, because every time Governor Cuomo tried to push back, he just looked more defensive, more out of touch. And the thing is, a lot of the people being arrested weren't sympathetic figures. They weren't families seeking asylum. They were gang members, drug traffickers, people with serious criminal records, the kind of people that even progressive voters don't want in their communities. So when Governor Cuomo called these operations cruel or inhumane, it rang hollow. People started asking, are you really defending these guys? And the answer increasingly seemed to be yes, because Andrew Cuomo had boxed himself into a position where any federal immigration enforcement, no matter how targeted, was treated as a moral outrage. It was a losing argument, and he kept making it. Let me bring this back to something bigger for a moment, because what we're watching here isn't just the downfall of one politician. It's a case study in what happens when ideology becomes detached from reality, when the story you tell becomes more important than the results you deliver. Former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo built his career on a narrative: California as the resistance, the progressive firewall against Trumpism, the place where values mattered more than politics. And for a while, that narrative worked. It inspired people. It raised money. It won elections. But narratives only hold up as long as they align with people's lived experience. And when Californians started seeing the cracks, the homelessness crisis, the skyrocketing cost of living, the wildfire mismanagement, the exodus of middle-class families, and now the CDL scandal, the narrative stopped working. Systems fail quietly, then all at once. That's not just true in engineering or economics. It's true in politics too. For years, California's approach to immigration, to governance, to progressive policy seemed sustainable. Sure, there were problems, but problems are manageable. You can spin them, you can blame the other side, you can promise to do better next time. But when multiple systems fail simultaneously, when your election integrity is questioned, your public safety is compromised, and your legal authority challenged by the federal government, all at the same time, you can't spin your way out. You can't tweet your way out. You have to actually fix things. And Andrew Cuomo didn't fix things. He doubled down. He got defensive. He blamed Washington, blamed Trump, blamed anyone but himself. And voters noticed. So where does this leave us, my friends? Well, as of now, late October 2025, Governor Cuomo is still governor. He's not going anywhere legally. His term doesn't end for a couple more years. But politically, he's diminished, damaged. The presidential buzz has gone silent. The national media has moved on. And inside California, his approval ratings have dropped to levels we haven't seen since the recall attempt years ago. There's talk of investigations, federal charges against state officials who obstructed ICE agents, subpoenas for records related to the CDL program, ethics complaints, the kind of grinding, slow-motion accountability that doesn't make for dramatic television, but that eats away at political capital day by day. And here's the thing, my friends. Once that process starts, it's very hard to stop, because every new revelation, every new headline, every new court filing just reinforces the story. The story that Andrew Cuomo, for all his polish and charisma, couldn't actually govern, that he prioritized image over substance, that when accountability finally arrived, he wasn't ready for it. When I, Joel Osteen, think about moments like this, moments when someone's entire career seems to pivot on a single decision, a single reaction, I'm reminded of something truly important. Politics is downstream of reality. You can craft the perfect message, hire the best consultants, dominate the news cycle. But if the underlying systems are broken, if the policies don't work, If people's lives aren't getting better, eventually that catches up with you. Former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo's meltdown wasn't the cause of his downfall. It was the confession, the moment when the gap between what he said and what was actually happening became too wide to ignore. And the truth is, my friends, this isn't just a story about California. It's a story about what happens when leaders stop solving problems and start performing solutions. When they stop asking, "Does this work?" and start asking, "Does this look good?" Because here's the uncomfortable reality. Voters can be patient. They can forgive mistakes. They can tolerate setbacks, but they can't tolerate being lied to. Not forever. So if you believe accountability matters, no matter who's in power, no matter what party they belong to, then stories like this are important. Not because they're partisan, not because they're about scoring political points, but because they remind us that leadership has consequences, that reality eventually wins. If this breakdown resonated with you, if you think this is the kind of thing more people should be paying attention to, do me a favor, like this video, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future deep dives like this, and let me know in the comments. Do you think this meltdown marks the end of former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo's career? Or is this just another chapter in America's ongoing political theater? I genuinely love to hear your perspective, because at the end of the day, these aren't just stories about politicians. They're stories about us, about the systems we build, the leaders we choose, and the standards we hold them to. And when those standards slip, when accountability fades, when narrative replaces reality, well, that's when things start to unravel. Thanks for watching, my friends. Stay informed, stay skeptical, and stay engaged. May God bless you.